The fluorescent lights inside the quick-stop grocery store on the outskirts of Detroit hummed with an irritating, insect-like buzz, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the linoleum floor that was scuffed by decades of work boots. It was late October, and the biting wind rattled the plate-glass windows, carrying the promise of a harsh winter that this particular neighborhood was ill-equipped to handle. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee, industrial cleaner, and the damp wool of coats worn by people who had been waiting too long at bus stops. Emily stood at the counter, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold metal can of baby formula, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down at her 6-month-old son, Leo, who was fussing in the carrier strapped to her chest, his small face red with the beginnings of a hunger cry that she dreaded more than anything in the world. She had done the math 3 times in her head while standing in line, but the numbers refused to change. She had exactly $11 in her pocket, the formula cost $22, and her car was running on fumes that wouldn't get her to her waitressing shift the next morning if she didn't put gas in it right now. Behind the counter, the clerk, a teenage boy with acne scars and headphones draped around his neck, stared at her with a mixture of boredom and impatience, popping a bubble of gum that sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. Emily's voice trembled as she pushed the can forward, her eyes failing to meet his, the shame burning hot on her neck and cheeks. She explained, in a whisper that barely rose above the hum of the refrigerators, that she needed to return the item, hoping to get cash back, even though she had lost the receipt in the chaotic mess of her diaper bag. The clerk sighed theatrically, rolling his eyes as he tapped a few buttons on the register, the machine letting out a harsh beep that signaled rejection, a sound that felt like a public indictment of her failure as a mother. He told her flatly that without a receipt he couldn't do anything, his voice carrying the indifference of someone who had seen poverty every day and had grown calluses over his empathy. Emily felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, the room spinning slightly as the reality of her situation crashed down. She had to choose between feeding her son tonight or losing the job that fed them both next week. In the back of the store, near the refrigerated beer section, a shadow detached itself from the gloom, a massive figure clad in worn leather and denim that smelled of gasoline, tobacco, and rain. Silas was a man who took up space unapologetically, his arms thick with muscle and covered in tattoos that faded into the sleeves of his cut, a leather vest bearing the insignia of the Iron Vanguard, a motorcycle club known throughout the state for its uncompromising nature. He had stopped in for a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of water, but his attention had been snagged by the scene unfolding at the counter, a scene that scratched at an old, jagged wound deep in his psyche. He watched the young mother, saw the fraying hem of her coat, the dark circles etched under her eyes, and the way her hand shook as she tried to comfort the crying infant while negotiating for her dignity. It wasn't just a woman struggling, it was a mirror reflecting a past Silas thought he had buried under miles of asphalt and years of violence. Silas remembered the hollow ache of an empty stomach, the specific gnawing pain that kept a child awake at night, while his own mother wept in the next room, helpless against a world that demanded money she didn't have. He stood perfectly still, a silent monolith in the aisle, his dark eyes narrowing as he watched the clerk dismiss Emily with a wave of his hand, turning his attention to a magazine as if she had ceased to exist. The other customers in the line shifted uncomfortably, checking their phones or studying the floor tiles, practicing the polite societal blindness that allows people to ignore suffering when it is standing right in front of them. No one stepped forward, no one offered $1. They just wanted her to move so they could buy their lottery tickets and six-packs and go home to their warm living rooms. The isolation surrounding Emily was palpable. A cold wall that separated her from the rest of humanity, leaving her alone on an island of desperation. The baby's cry escalated into a wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated need that pierced the thick atmosphere of the store, causing the clerk to frown and point toward the door, muttering something about disturbing the peace. Emily shrank inward, her shoulders hunching as she grabbed the can of formula, her fingers trembling so violently she almost dropped it, preparing to leave with nothing but her shame. She turned, her face wet with silent tears, and that was when the heavy thud of boots on linoleum stopped her in her tracks. Silas moved with a deceptive speed for a man of his size, covering the distance between the beer cooler and the counter in long, purposeful strides that made the floorboards creak under his weight. The atmosphere in the store shifted instantly from awkwardness to fear. People stepped back instinctively, their eyes widening at the sight of the biker's patches, the 1% diamond on his chest, signaling that he operated outside the polite rules of society. He didn't look at the other customers. His gaze was fixed solely on the clerk, a stare so intense and devoid of warmth that the teenager swallowed his gum and froze, his hand hovering over the magazine. Silas didn't shout, didn't make a scene. He simply reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a thick roll of cash, held together by a rubber band, the kind of money that wasn't withdrawn from an ATM. He slammed the roll onto the counter next to the baby formula, the sound echoing like a gavel strike, demanding absolute attention. He looked at Emily, not with pity, which she would have hated, but with a profound, stoic recognition, a silent acknowledgement that he saw her war and respected her fight. He told the clerk, in a voice that sounded like gravel grinding together, to ring up the formula, and then he gestured with a jerk of his chin toward the rest of the store. "Everything," Silas grunted, his voice low and vibrating through the small space. "Whatever she needs. Diapers, food, milk for herself. Fill a cart." Emily stared at him, stunned into paralysis, her brain unable to process the sudden shift from despair to salvation, her mouth opening and closing without sound. She tried to protest, her pride flaring up even in her desperation, stammering that she couldn't pay him back, that she didn't know who he was. Silas ignored her protest completely, grabbing a shopping cart from the stack near the door and shoving it toward her with a gentleness that contradicted his terrifying appearance. He told her to move, his tone leaving no room for argument, effectively taking command of the situation as if it were a military operation rather than a grocery run. The other customers watched in stunned silence as the terrifying biker walked down the aisles with the crying mother, pulling items off the shelves. Boxes of cereal, jars of baby food, fresh fruit, bread, things that were luxuries to Emily in her current state. He moved with efficiency, scanning labels for nutritional value, tossing bags of rice and beans into the cart, ensuring she had staples that would last. For the first time in months, Emily felt a burden lift, replaced by a surreal sense of shock and gratitude that made her knees weak. The clerk scanned the items with trembling hands, the beep of the register now sounding like a symphony of victory rather than a death knell. Silas paid for it all, peeling off bills without counting, leaving a generous tip on the counter that the clerk didn't deserve but was too terrified to refuse. As they walked out of the store, the automatic doors sliding open to the rainy night, the cold air hit them. But Emily didn't feel it. She was insulated by the warmth of the encounter. Silas carried the heavy bags to her rusted sedan, waiting patiently as she unlocked the door and placed Leo in his car seat. He didn't ask for her number, didn't make a pass at her, didn't ask for a favor in return. He simply loaded the groceries into her trunk and closed it with a solid thud. He looked at her one last time, his face unreadable in the neon glow of the store sign, and told her to keep her head up, that storms don't last forever. Then he turned, straddled his massive black Harley-Davidson, kicked the starter, and roared away into the darkness, leaving Emily standing in the rain, her life irrevocably altered by a stranger who looked like a villain but acted like a guardian angel. She sat in her car for 10 minutes before she could drive, gripping the steering wheel, sobbing not out of sadness, but out of relief the scent of fresh groceries filling the car, a smell she would forever associate with hope. But as she drove home, watching the red taillights of the city blur through the rain on her windshield, she didn't realize that Silas hadn't just bought her groceries. He had taken note of her license plate, her hesitation, and the deep, haunted look in her eyes that suggested her troubles went far beyond a lack of milk. He had seen a vulnerability that required more than cash to fix, and as he rode back to the clubhouse, the gears of a much larger machine began to turn in his mind. The encounter was the trigger, and the bullet had already left the chamber. The following week, the reality of Emily's life in the decaying suburb of Oakwood crashed back down with renewed force, threatening to erode the temporary relief Silas's generosity had provided. The groceries had filled her cupboards, yes, but the walls of her apartment were still thin, the heating was still temperamental, and the neighborhood was still a place where locking the door 3 times was a necessity, not a habit. She worked double shifts at the diner, her feet swelling in cheap shoes, serving coffee to truckers and locals who tipped in loose change, all while her mind raced with the anxiety of impending bills. The landlord, a man named Mr. Henderson, who wore cheap suits and carried the stench of desperation and greed, had been circling her like a vulture, making veiled threats about eviction if the rent wasn't paid in full by the first, ignoring her pleas about the broken radiator and the mold in the bathroom. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, in the fortified compound that served as the headquarters for the Iron Vanguard, Silas sat at the scarred wooden table in the chapel, the club's meeting room, nursing a beer and staring at a crumpled piece of paper. He had run Emily's license plate through a contact at the DMV, a breach of privacy that sat heavily on him, yet felt necessary given the desperation he had smelled on her. He found out she was a widow, her husband killed in a factory accident 2 years prior, a settlement that had been swallowed by medical bills and funeral costs, leaving her with nothing but debt and a newborn. The information gnawed at him. It wasn't just poverty she was fighting. It was a systemic collapse of her support system, a situation where one wrong move meant total ruin. His brothers in the club, men with names like Tank, Rook, and Preacher, noticed his distraction, the way he cleaned his weapon with excessive force, or how he stared into the middle distance during their poker games. When he finally voiced his thoughts, explaining the situation with the woman at the store, the reaction was mixed. The younger prospects, eager to prove their toughness, scoffed at the idea of charity, muttering about not being a Salvation Army. But the older members, men who had seen the inside of prison cells and war zones, listened in silence, understanding the code that Silas lived by. That strength without purpose was just bullying. The conflict in the room was palpable, a clash between the hardened criminal exterior they projected and the hidden vein of honor that held the brotherhood together. Silas didn't care about the prospects' opinions. His conflict was internal, a battle between the urge to intervene and the knowledge that his world was dangerous and toxic for civilians. Bringing a civilian, especially a single mother, into the orbit of the Iron Vanguard could paint a target on her back, inviting scrutiny from local law enforcement or rival gangs who might see her as a leverage point. He wrestled with the morality of it, pacing the perimeter of the compound at night, the gravel crunching under his boots, debating whether his help would ultimately be a curse in disguise. Yet, every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cashier's sneer and the baby's red, tear-streaked face, and the decision solidified in his gut like concrete. Back at the apartment complex, the situation escalated when Mr. Henderson banged on Emily's door at 7 in the morning, his fist shaking the fragile wood frame, shouting loud enough for the neighbors to hear. He wasn't just asking for rent anymore, he was demanding advances and making lewd comments about alternative ways she could pay, his eyes roving over her in her bathrobe with a predatory gleam. Emily stood in the doorway, clutching Leo, terrified and humiliated, her voice shaking as she threatened to call the police. A threat Henderson laughed off. knowing the police in this district took hours to respond to non-emergency calls. He left with a final warning that she had 3 days to pay or get out, leaving Emily trembling in her hallway, the safety of her home shattered. She felt the walls closing in, the groceries Silas had bought now seeming like a cruel taunt, food in the pantry but no roof over their heads. She considered running, packing the car and driving until the gas ran out, maybe finding a shelter in another state, but the thought of living out of a car with an infant in November paralyzed her with fear. She was trapped in a conflict of circumstances where every path led to a dead end, her resilience eroding under the constant, grinding pressure of survival. She didn't know that she was being watched, not by a predator, but by a prospect Silas had sent to keep an eye on the building, a young biker sitting in a parked sedan across the street, reporting everything back to the club. When the prospect reported the landlord's aggression and the specific nature of his threats, the mood in the Iron Vanguard clubhouse shifted instantly, the air changing from casual camaraderie to cold, focused violence. The debate about charity ended the moment a woman and child were threatened. For men who lived outside the law, the protection of the innocent was one of the few absolute moral pillars they still respected. Silas stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his face darkening with a rage that was terrifying in its stillness. He didn't have to give a speech. He simply looked at the table, at his brothers, and nodded. The conflict of paths, her desperate struggle for survival and his dangerous world of outlaw justice, was about to intersect violently. Silas knew that simply paying her rent wouldn't solve the problem with a man like Henderson. Predators didn't stop because they were fed. They stopped when they were frightened. He was done wrestling with the ethics of intervention. The time for subtle charity had passed, and the time for a display of force had arrived. He walked to the wall where the keys to the bikes hung, grabbing his set, the metallic jingle sounding like a bell tolling for the landlord. Emily spent that night pushing a dresser against her front door, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, holding a kitchen knife as she sat on the edge of her bed, watching Leo sleep. She felt completely alone in the universe, unaware that a few miles away engines were firing up, chrome was being polished, and a formation was being organized. She thought her life was ending, falling into the abyss. But in reality, the cavalry was mounting up. The tension in the city that night was thick, the humidity holding the exhaust fumes close to the ground, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Silas led the column out of the compound gate, the roar of 20 motorcycles shattering the quiet of the night, a mechanical beast awakening to hunt. They weren't going to war with a rival gang. They were riding to an apartment complex in the slums, a destination that seemed beneath them, yet meant everything to the man leading the pack. The paths had collided, and there was no turning back. The afternoon of the eviction deadline was grey and suffocating, the sky a bruised purple that mirrored the dread in Emily's stomach as she packed the last of her clothes into garbage bags. She hadn't found the money, and she knew Henderson would be back at 5 p.m. sharp, likely with the sheriff or, worse, with his own hired thugs to physically throw her onto the street. The apartment was stripped bare of the little comfort it had, reflecting the hollowness she felt inside. She had failed, and the weight of that failure crushed her chest, making it hard to breathe. At 4:45 p.m., a black SUV pulled up to the curb, and Henderson stepped out, flanked by 2 large men who looked like they enjoyed their work, a smirk of triumph plastered on his sweaty face as he looked up at her window. Emily watched from behind the curtain, her heart seizing, realizing this was the breaking point, the moment her life fractured irreparably. She clutched Leo to her chest, whispering apologies he couldn't understand, bracing herself for the inevitable pounding on the door, the shouting, the physical removal. But before Henderson could even reach the front steps of the building, a low rumble began to vibrate through the air, a sound that started as a distant hum and quickly grew into a deafening, earth-shaking roar that rattled the window panes in their frames. Henderson stopped, looking around in confusion, his hired muscles stepping back nervously as the sound grew louder, encompassing the entire block, bouncing off the brick buildings like thunder. Then they appeared, turning the corner onto the narrow residential street. A phalanx of motorcycles rolled in, 2 by 2, a river of chrome and black leather that seemed endless. They didn't speed. They moved with a slow, menacing deliberation, the engines growling in a unified, synchronized rhythm that commanded primal fear. Leading the formation was Silas, his face obscured by dark sunglasses and a helmet, but his posture unmistakable. A king riding into battle. The bikers filled the street, mounting the curbs, blocking the SUV, effectively encircling Henderson and his men in a ring of steel and exhaust. The neighborhood, usually quiet and fearful, came alive. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open, and people peered out, stunned by the invasion of the Iron Vanguard in their forgotten corner of the city. Silas cut his engine, and one by one, the other 19 bikes fell silent. The sudden quiet more terrifying than the noise had been. The silence was heavy, pregnant with the threat of violence. Silas dismounted slowly, kicking his stand down, and walked toward Henderson, who was now pale, sweating profusely, his earlier arrogance evaporating like mist. The 2 thugs he had brought with him wisely backed away, hands raised, signaling they wanted no part of whatever this was. Silas stopped inches from Henderson, towering over the landlord, invading his personal space with an intensity that made the smaller man shrink. He didn't yell, he spoke in a low, conversational tone that carried perfectly in the unnatural silence of the street. "I hear you're having trouble with a tenant," Silas said, his voice scraping like sandpaper. "We're here to help her move, and we're here to discuss the security deposit." Behind him, the other bikers dismounted, crossing their arms, creating a wall of intimidation that no eviction notice could penetrate. Henderson stammered, trying to cite the lease, trying to regain some authority, but his voice cracked, high and pathetic. Up in the apartment, Emily watched in disbelief, her hands covering her mouth, realizing with a jolt that this army was for her. The fear of the landlord vanished, replaced by a profound, overwhelming shock that the man from the grocery store had returned, and he had brought an apocalypse with him. She grabbed her keys and ran down the stairs, bursting out the front door just as Silas was handing Henderson an envelope. Not with money for rent, but with a legal document one of the club's lawyers had drafted, citing code violations and harassment. "She's leaving," Silas told the landlord, his eyes hidden behind the dark lenses. "But she leaves on our terms. And if I hear you chased her or kept a dime of her money, we'll come back for tea." The break in the tension was absolute. Henderson grabbed the envelope, nodded frantically and scrambled back to his SUV, his tires screeching as he fled the scene, abandoning any thought of eviction or harassment. The bikers erupted in low laughter, a dark, satisfied sound. Silas turned to Emily, who stood on the porch, trembling not with fear, but with the release of adrenaline. He took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were tired but kind. "Pack your stuff," he said simply. "We got a truck coming. You're not staying in this dump." The scene that followed was surreal. Hardened bikers, men who were feared across the county, carrying boxes of baby clothes, dismantling a crib, and carefully packing kitchenware. They moved with a surprising respect for her meager belongings, treating her cracked plates like fine china. The neighbors came out onto their porches, watching in awe, as the criminals acted with more honor than the landlord ever had. Emily stood in the middle of the whirlwind, tears streaming down her face, not of sadness, but of a heart breaking open to receive kindness she hadn't believed existed. It was the climax of her struggle, the moment the oppressive weight of her poverty was shattered by an external force. The break wasn't a breakdown of her spirit, but a breaking of the chains that held her. As the last box was loaded into a support truck that had arrived, Silas approached her, handing her a helmet. "You ride in the truck with the kid," he said. "We'll escort you. Nobody touches you, not today, not ever." As the convoy moved out, Emily in the passenger seat of the truck, clutching Leo, she looked back at the empty apartment building. The fear was gone. The isolation was gone. She was surrounded by 20 roaring engines, a procession of guardians in leather vests. The breaking point had become a turning point, flipping the narrative of her life from victimhood to protection in a single, thunderous afternoon. The aftermath of the intervention rippled through Emily's life and the community in ways no one, not even Silas, could have predicted. The Iron Vanguard moved her into a small, clean rental house in a safer district, a property owned by an associate of the club who owed them a favor. The rent was manageable, the heating worked, and for the first time in Leo's life, he slept through the night in a room that didn't draft. But the material changes, while life-saving, were secondary to the psychological shift that occurred within Emily. The constant buzzing anxiety that had defined her existence for 2 years began to recede, replaced by a cautious sense of stability. She no longer walked with her head down. She walked with the knowledge that she had people behind her, a powerful, invisible safety net. However, the consequences weren't entirely simple. The presence of the bikers in her life drew stares and whispers. When Silas or one of the others stopped by to check on the house or drop off supplies, neighbors peeked through blinds, judging, wondering what a nice girl was doing with those people. Emily found herself defending them to her co-workers at the diner, realizing that the world's perception of good and bad people was deeply flawed. She lost a few friends who were too respectable to associate with someone connected to a biker gang, but she gained a family of 20 uncles who would literally take a bullet for her son. The trade-off in her eyes was overwhelmingly in her favor. For Silas, the consequences were internal. The act of saving Emily had awakened a dormant part of the club's identity. The younger prospects, who had initially scoffed at the charity, saw the respect Silas commanded and the genuine gratitude in Emily's eyes, and they began to understand the true meaning of the patch they wanted to wear. It wasn't just about being outlaw, it was about being a tribe. The club started doing more community outreach, quietly, without fanfare, organizing toy drives and protecting other vulnerable locals from predatory landlords. The atmosphere in the clubhouse shifted from pure hedonism to a more disciplined, purposeful brotherhood. Silas found a measure of peace he hadn't known since before the war. The ghosts of his childhood hunger quieted by the sight of Leo growing plump and happy, but the connection also brought emotional complexity. Emily and Silas developed a bond that defied easy categorization. It wasn't a romance. Silas was too damaged, too entrenched in a violent world, and he respected her too much to drag her fully into it, but it was a deep, platonic intimacy. They would sit on her porch on Sunday afternoons, him smoking a cigarette, her drinking tea, watching Leo play in the grass. They spoke little but understood everything. She saw the weariness in him, the toll his life took, and he saw the steel in her, the resilience of a mother. This relationship became a sanctuary for both, a quiet space between the noise of his engines and the chaos of her survival. The most profound consequence, however, was on the town itself. The story of the grocery store rescue spread, growing into a local urban legend. People began to look at the Iron Vanguard differently, not with less fear, but with more nuance. And more importantly, people began to look at struggling mothers differently. The cashier at the Quick Stop, shamed by the memory of that night, started a small donation jar for the local food bank. The act of compassion had been a stone thrown in a pond, and the ripples were touching shores Silas never intended to reach. Yet, there was friction. The police kept a closer eye on the club, suspicious of their sudden altruism, assuming it was a front for something illegal. Emily was pulled over twice, questioned about her association with known felons. She stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated, her fear of authority replaced by a fierce loyalty to the men who had saved her. She realized that protection came with a price, the price of being an outsider. She accepted it willingly. One evening, Emily came home to find a bag of groceries on her porch, not from Silas, but from a neighbor who had previously judged her. A note attached read, "For the baby." The wall of shame had completely crumbled. Emily sat on the steps and cried, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming realization that she was part of a community again. The emotional wear and tear on Silas was visible, though. Protecting Emily meant worrying about her, a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself in decades. He found himself checking his phone, driving past her street late at night, just to make sure the lights were on. It was a burden, but a welcome one. It gave him a reason to ride that wasn't just about running away. Ultimately, the consequences reshaped the definition of family for everyone involved. Blood hadn't bound them. A can of baby formula and a moment of shared humanity had. The bikers became softer in the presence of the baby. The mother became tougher in the face of the world, and the lines between criminal and hero blurred into irrelevant grey. 6 months later, spring had finally broken the chokehold of winter, turning the grey skies of Michigan into a brilliant, hopeful blue. Emily stood behind the counter of a new bakery downtown, wiping flour from her hands. It was a job she had secured through a network of local business owners who respected the Iron Vanguard, or at least respected their custom. She wasn't rich, she wasn't living a fairy tale, but she was solvent. She paid her own rent, she bought her own formula, and she looked the world in the eye. The dark circles were gone, replaced by a glow of health and hard-won confidence. Leo was crawling now, a chaos engine of energy, often seen wearing a tiny leather vest the club had gifted him, a mascot of the toughest family in town. The resolution wasn't a grand finale with explosions or a wedding. It was the quiet, powerful victory of normalcy. The Iron Vanguard had pulled back slightly, giving her space to live her life, no longer hovering like overprotective hawks, but remaining a constant, distant presence, a threat to anyone who might wish her harm, a comfort to her. They were no longer her rescuers. They were her friends. Silas came by every Friday for a coffee and a scone, paying for it, always tipping too much, a ritual that anchored both their weeks. On this particular Friday, the shop was busy. The bell above the door chimed, and Silas walked in, looking dusty from a long ride. He ordered his black coffee, leaning against the counter as Emily worked. There was no need for heavy speeches. He watched her interact with customers, smiling, efficient, safe. He saw the transformation, from the terrified, trembling girl in the grocery store to this capable, strong woman. He realized his job was done. He hadn't just saved her, he had helped her save herself. "Club's going on a run," Silas mentioned casually, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "West Coast, be gone a few weeks." It was his way of saying goodbye for a while, of loosening the tether. Emily stopped wiping the counter and looked at him. She reached across and placed her hand over his rough, scarred knuckles. "We'll be here," she said, her voice steady. "Ride safe, Silas." He nodded, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his eyes. He turned and walked out, the heavy door closing with a soft click. Emily watched through the window as he mounted his bike, the chrome gleaming in the sun. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He kicked the engine to life, the roar familiar and comforting, and pulled out into traffic, merging with the flow of life. The story didn't end with a magical solution to poverty or a complete redemption of the outlaw lifestyle. The world was still hard, the club was still dangerous, and Emily still had bills. But the crushing weight of isolation was gone. The resolution was found in the dignity of independence, supported by the loyalty of the unexpected. As Silas disappeared down the road, Emily picked up her son, who was playing in a playpen in the corner. She held him up to the window. "Look, Leo," she whispered. "That's family." The camera of the mind pulls back, showing the bakery on the busy street, then the town, then the highway, where a lone biker rides toward the horizon, a modern knight in dirty denim. The narrative closes not on a perfect ending, but on a real one, Life continues, but it is better, stronger and warmer because one man chose to stop and look rather than look away. The shame was gone, replaced by an unbreakable strength.